This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Jenny Ifft, K-State Agricultural Policy Specialist, with history about the Farm Bill and agriculture during the 1960s and 70s. She explains the Great Grain Robbery and government cheese during this time. K-State Beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff keeps the show going with information about what livestock antibiotics will now be needing a prescription. He also discusses upcoming guidance about growth implants. Finishing today's show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk, as he encourages dairy farmers to purchase their straw for the coming year and explore options for extending straw supplies throughout the year. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show how we usually do right now with a Farm Bill update, and we're still kind of going through the history of leading up to where we currently are with the Farm Bill. And today we're going to talk about the 60s and 70s, and to talk about that, we have K-State Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flintshire Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us once again.
Great to be here.
Starting with the 60s, a few things happened during that time period.
Yeah, and the big theme for foreign policy in the 60s is basically the same as the 50s. It's continued grappling, difficulty finding compromises with supply management and setting support prices or parity prices. So what had basically continued to happen is you had the government offering fairly high support prices. Technology was improving, productivity was increasing, and you had a lot of grain. You had a lot of crops, more that could be used, but difficulty politically lowering those support prices or making those acreage restrictions high enough to have an impact. People don't like being told how much to produce. They didn't like it then. Most people don't like it today. So there's this continued struggle during this period. So that drove a lot of the policy. You had something that did go through called the Special Feed Grain Program, and I won't get too much into the details, but it did incentivize producers to reduce their acres, and they could get some type of payment for that. Another one was a proposal for commodity boards, and this didn't go through, but this would have given commodity groups, producer-run commodity groups, the power to form boards, like, say, a wheat board or a corn board, that could impose production controls. And there were other countries that were doing this at the time, but that was not popular enough to get through Congress. So there were these efforts during this period, and you did have some reform in 1965 in that Farm Bill. It might not look like reform today, but if you go back into history, the 1965 Farm Bill set parity at 65 to 90%, which, remember we talked about the 50s, the battle was going from 75 to 92% of parity, and that was such a battle in the 50s. Well, in 65, they got it even more flexible, and the idea was that they were trying to get domestic prices closer to global prices to really manage this imbalance of commodities.
And that was a quick, kind of overview of what happened in the 60s in relation to agriculture and the Farm Bill. And so moving forward on into the 70s, food stamps.
Yeah, so food stamps were authorized but not used by the Eisenhower administration. They were authorized in the 50s. They started being used in the 60s by the Kennedy administration. And this really relates to a couple of sort of broader themes with the Farm Bill. The first is a sort of growing coalition or group of stakeholders over history. So, you have the, say, conservation programs brought in environmental interests. And with food stamps, with anti-hunger programs, this would bring in urban legislators that might not have much of an interest in production agriculture, but were concerned about hunger issues for their constituents. It is important to note that although food stamps, nutrition programs did bring urban interests into the Farm Bill, where, we call it the Food and Farm Bill a lot now, the rural legislators, rural people, also faced hunger and do benefit from these programs.
Another thing during the 70s was rural development started to kind of get going.
So in this 1970, you had a rural development title. So the different sections of the Farm Bill are called titles. You had this rural development title added to the Farm Bill. And this is where rural governments can get money for different, infrastructure-related projects and providing other services. So, that brought another group into the Farm Bill coalition and provided benefits to rural communities.
And kind of an important part also this, and also kind of interesting for me personally as we look back now, the Great Grain Robbery. What was that?
First of all, the early 1970s, you had increasing trade. There was high prices. There was a lot of optimism. But the high prices are, for producers, right? If you're a country that's importing grain, maybe not so exciting. And the Soviet Union, 1972, they had grain shortages. But they were tightly controlling information. So they had grain shortages. They needed to import grain. Again, pretty good information control. And what they did, so if they would have made a big announcement, we're going to go buy a bunch of grain on world markets, prices would have gone up right away. But they didn't do that. They went and made these deals individually with different groups, with different exporters. They even got promotional or subsidized export financing from the U.S. government. So they went and did this quietly. Eventually the news came out, and there was a lot of outrage and a lot of, I think you can say, conspiracy theories that, the Secretary of Agriculture was in cahoots with the Soviet Union. There was a lot of pushback from this. Now, some of it might have been sensational, but there were some lasting changes that came out of this where, sort of more investment into satellites to try to understand global trends in grain yields, and then understanding crop production and those trends. It's a matter of not just sort of having orderly markets, but also potentially a matter of national security. And it continues today.
And another thing kind of moving forward with groups of people, Nixon in 1973, we had target prices.
Yeah. So one interesting thing, so we did have high commodity prices, good for producers, they can hurt consumers. Well, Nixon put price controls for meat sold in the grocery store, so for meat sold in retail. And that's the last time we've seen any sort of price controls on the consumer side in the United States. There are other types of, nutrition programs that can support consumers or people that are facing hunger. But it was bad enough that the president of the U.S. did that. And then you had the 1973 Farm Bill, and there was the target prices, like you mentioned. That was another major reform. I believe one of the reasons this was able to go through was because markets were strong. At this point, there was a lot of optimism. But what target prices did is they allowed there to be a market price. So instead of the USDA setting a support price, we will buy your grain at this price, what that did is the USDA said, we will make up the difference between the market price and our target price by paying you directly. So it didn't totally get the government out of markets, but it distanced the government from markets more and let there be a market price for grain. In the early 70s, you also, we talked about acreage restrictions or acreage allotments. So in the 1970 Farm Bill, you had the general set aside. So instead of having, allotments or restrictions with specific crops, farms just had to set aside a certain part of their land. So, there was this movement towards increasing flexibility, increasing market orientation in the 70s.
And another thing moving forward with that was dairy farmers and having prices back up to parity and creating something called government cheese.
Yeah, and that all goes back to a campaign promise that Jimmy Carter made to help family farms, to help struggling dairy farmers. He promised to go back to parity. And, in 1977, he kept that promise, and parity prices went up to 80%, which incentivized a lot of producers. And, that was the price that had to be paid. So people were increasing production. You had surplus milk. One way to get rid of that is to make cheese. It takes a lot of milk, relatively, to make cheese. Cheese can be stored. Milk can't be stored. So there was a lot of cheese, that the government held. And eventually they used caves in Kansas City to store cheese. So, you hear a lot about, government cheese in popular culture and songs. Apparently, it was, some people liked its melting properties. So, but yeah, that goes back to a campaign promise that was kept by Jimmy Carter.
An interesting fun fact there for cheese in Kansas City. And kind of as we round out the 70s, we have start seeing prices decrease and discontent that eventually will lead to the farm crisis.
Yeah, so commodity prices were highest in the early 70s, and they had come down by the late 70s. At the same time, you've had these sort of incremental reforms to increase market orientation in the Farm Bill. So you had something called the American Ag Movement, and they had over 1,000 offices across the U.S. They attempted a production strike in 1978 and 1979, which didn't have much of an aggregate impact, but people were mobilized. There was a tractorcade. Perhaps some of our listeners participated or remembered that, where farmers drove their tractors to Washington, D.C. to raise awareness of those low farm income and other issues in the farm community.
A lot of interesting information there. And so as we conclude our 70s, and we'll talk into then next week talking about the 80s, what are some key points that you want producers to remember thinking about the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think, probably the two themes are that sort of the coalition, the importance of coalitions to the Farm Bill and adding groups, where you had, food stamps, nutrition interests, you had rural development. So the sort of continuing growth of the Farm Bill is really something that helped. It was an important part of the entire package. I think it's also important to remember the struggles with supply management and how that really drove farm policy debates for so many decades. I mean, today we're discussing income support, risk management programs for farmers, but we're not discussing supply management anymore. And I think that's a major, and when we talk about the 80s and 90s, we'll talk about why that happened. But the fact that we're not, dealing with supply management anymore, or the government's not dealing with supply management, it was a big theme in history.
Definitely a conversation we'll look forward to as we continue this next week. Jenny, I appreciate you coming in.
Great to be here.
That was Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchball Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show today with K-State Beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff to talk a little bit about the antibiotics that you may now need a prescription with, and then we'll touch on some implant changes that may be coming. A.J., thank you for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be on.
And A.J., the topic that we want to talk about in today's show and maybe get some more clarification on is that producers are now needing a prescription for certain antibiotics for their livestock.
Yeah, so there's just a little bit of clarification. This is a new directive. It's called a Guidance for Industry, number 263, which for most folks, that doesn't mean anything. That's just how FDA codes different things. So this directive, it's an extension off of, many folks probably remember the veterinary feed directive, how we, did away with production use of medically important antibiotics, transitioned those to have oversight by a veterinarian, which, we had some bumps here and there getting that up and going in 2017, but now it's just normal practice. Now today, notice I mentioned medically important antibiotics, right? Now, medically important just means that we have a shared use of antibiotic class between veterinary medicine and human medicine. So all of those antibiotic classes that are used in both are what's considered medically important. And that's really what has been the target of FDA, to ensure the prudent use and the long-term use to, number one, have continued efficacy of these products, which if we're going to use them, we need them to work. Two is also to curb some of the antibiotic resistance concerns that we have both in human medicine and veterinary medicine.
And so this is something that went into effect on June 11th. However, it's maybe not being seen everywhere quite yet.
Correct. So just to back up a little bit, the GFI 263, we already have prescription medically important antibiotics that have been prescription forever. So a lot of times if you had to go to your veterinarian to purchase a product, chances are it may have been prescription, right? And all of the medically important antibiotics that are used in feed obviously falls under VFD. Now, there was one thing that kind of got missed out. There's been a handful of products that are considered medically important, but they fell under over-the-counter status. And essentially all that means is you did not have to have a veterinary prescription to be able to purchase and use them. So these would be products that were commonly sold and purchased from feed stores, from some of the chain stores where you can walk in and there's a bottle of penicillin or a bottle of oxytetracycline. And I use those two as the main example because by volume, those would probably be the biggest products that have been purchased over the counter, penicillin and oxytet. So those products specifically are transitioning from over-the-counter status to prescription. They're not going away. Okay, I just want to make sure everybody knows we're not losing the opportunity to purchase and use these products, but we do now have veterinary supervision to ensure the proper use. Now, what does veterinary supervision look like? Well, it's a prescription. Right? So just like any of the other prescription medications, you've had a discussion with your veterinarian. You have a relationship with your local veterinarian that understands you, your animals, your production practices, all of those things. It's called a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. So many folks may have heard about a VCPR, or maybe your veterinarian, you reached out to a vet in the past and, a new vet, and they said, well, I need to establish a VCPR. Well, that's just that true understanding and actually a legal relationship that the veterinarian understands that they are taking on the responsibility to make some of the medical decisions. In return, the producer agrees they're going to follow the veterinarian's directions, and the vet's available for follow-up. So that is a true VCPR, so that needs to be established for the veterinarian to be able to provide a prescription. Those are kind of the key concepts with this GFI 263, and it only impacts a small number of products. So think penicillins, oxytet, over-the-counter injectables. There's a couple of, maybe sulfa boluses that can be used as well. Those would transition over to prescription. And then there are some mastitis treatments, mastitis tubes that have been over-the-counter that now will transition to prescription.
And as many things we talk about with you, AJ, the importance and the value you need to have with that connection with a veterinarian.
Absolutely. I mean, the true relationship with your local veterinarian is everything. They have the local expertise. They are the ones that follow up with you. They are the ones that you go to for advice, right? So having that relationship, go to them now. If this is something that you haven't heard about, that you didn't know there were some changes happening, go talk to your vet now. Each veterinary clinic is going to manage this a little bit differently. I know a lot of vet practices I've talked to that they've just purchased more product. They're running more inventory to make sure folks can just come into the clinic. They already have a working relationship. Boom, they can purchase those products as they have in the past. There are other clinics that, maybe the inventory isn't something that they want to manage, but they are more than happy to provide prescriptions for other outside distributors to either drop ship or some of the online distributors that are a registered pharmacy. Just keep in mind that whatever that is, that understanding with your veterinarian, have that planned out in advance, because nobody wants to, it's like, oh, I need a product and it's Sunday afternoon and the vet clinic's closed and you can't find it anywhere. I don't want that to happen to anybody. So communication, having those lines of communication with your vet, with the producer, that's such an important concept.
And AJ wanted to touch on the point that you are related mostly to beef. However, this is all states, all species. And so just something to keep in mind for all producers with livestock.
It's all producers, all livestock. Doesn't matter if you have 2 chickens in the backyard or a 10,000 head feed yard. It does impact everybody. This is overall antibiotic use for livestock in all of the U.S.
And there are some medicines that can still be purchased because they're not antibiotics.
And I've had this question that comes up. I'm glad you brought it up, that, confusion on what a medically important, product is. So keep in mind, these are just antibiotics that are used to treat and control disease. Okay, so when we think about vaccines, when we think about dewormers, some of the dewormers, when we think about ionophores, things like Menencin or Lasilicid that we can use for coccidiosis control. So those products have been over the counter, continue to be over the counter. They are not under prescription, so you can still purchase those. You still have ready access to some of those products for prevention and treatment of some of the internal parasite issues. So keep in mind that is not impacted by this directive. Only injectable and medically important antibiotics that were previously over the counter.
And something else that might be changing soon for producers to keep an eye on is implants and growth implants and what's changing there.
Yeah, growth promoting implants, right? I mean, they've been around for 50 plus years, even way more than 50 years. They are safe, they're effective to be able to produce more beef, more pounds of beef, with the same amount of resources. So an amazing tool that we have at our disposal for raising beef cattle. However, there has been some clarification, and with clarification comes confusion on how we use some of these growth promoting implants. And many times this new direction and this clarification that is coming from the FDA will be coming up here in July, but really it's about reimplanting and our different production phases. All of these growth-promoting implants are labeled for very specific classes of cattle at very specific times of their development. Okay, so basically we got, can we reimplant during the same production phase? And the answer is, and the clarification is, if it specifically says it on the label. So coming forward, we should have some more clarification and updated lists on all of the approved growth-promoting implants as well as their label claims and where they fall into. Can they be reimplanted during a production phase or not? And which production phase are they approved for? So that guidance will be coming out shortly, and some of that new clarification, I guess, going forward, my best point of advice for all producers is read the labels. If your growth promoting implant does not specifically say it is labeled for reimplant during a production phase, you can't. Okay? So again, that guidance, that directive, that will be going forward here in July of 2023. So from July on, make sure that we are using those products appropriately. Again, talk to your veterinarian. Make sure that if there's confusion, you have questions on that. Again, your local veterinarian is a phenomenal resource that knows you, knows what you're trying to do, and you may already be purchasing these products from them. So have that conversation. Have a more fruitful conversation whenever you get a chance to talk with them.
And AJ, if producers are wanting to find out more information about these two changes that are happening, where could they do that?
There is some information, some videos along with probably the recording from this radio podcast that can be found on KSUBeef.org, KSUBeef.org. You'll be able to find some further resources along with the FDA website. If you just search FDA, CVM, antibiotics, livestock, implants, it'll bring you up to their page. And those little keywords, I know because I typed them into Dr. Google earlier today, and it all pulls up to the same website. So that would be my best recommendation, KSUBeef.org, as well as the FDA website.
AJ, I appreciate you coming in today and giving us an update on some information that's happening.
You bet. Thank you.
That was Kansas State University beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff with some clarifying information about antibiotics that may now need a prescription and growth-promoting implants. If you'd like to find out more information about these topics and other topics related to beef cattle, you can do so by going to ksubeef.org. That will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. If you have beef cattle questions, you're welcome to reach out to your local extension office, or if it's a question you'd like talked about from multiple perspectives, you can also send your beef cattle questions to the Beef Cattle Institute at bci@ksu.edu, and they may be answered on our weekly Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts segments. We're cutting to a short break now, but we have more for you ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Straw for bedding and feed will soon be available. However, in the current market, it's going to be expensive. And while supply isn't expected to be an issue, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages dairy farmers to secure enough straw now for the coming year. Mike also covers some of the options available for extending straw supplies and reducing costs.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning bedding supplies for the coming year. As we approach and are into wheat harvest, we will start seeing some straw become available in the supply chain. However, it's going to be higher priced than probably most of us would like to pay for bedding. For those of us that are feeding straw in some of our diets, whether it be to heifers or to our transition cows, that feed cost is going to go up as well. I think we might be okay on supply, although in some areas, due to the shortness of the wheat this year, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. There is some wheat available that was actually harvested as hay rather than grain due to the low grain yield. So that would be available for feeding. Hopefully we wouldn't have to use that for bedding, but could utilize that in some of our heifer and transition cow diets if need be. But in general, I would encourage you to make sure that you have ample supply of straw for your bedding needs and feeding needs for the next year. And again, I know it's high-priced. Supplies will probably dwindle quickly, so getting this figured out during the summer is going to be paramount, I think, for most of our operations. Now, are there some alternatives to straw? And yes, there would be. For the calves, straw is a really difficult commodity to replace when we talk about bedding because of the insulation factor during the wintertime. You can switch to shavings, but many times that's going to be more expensive and some areas not very readily available either. So looking at an alternative for straw for calves, I think may come with some inherent problems. Now, for the summertime, we could maybe utilize sand possibly for the bedding. That can be utilized in hutches. It's a little more difficult to work with, doesn't absorb as much liquid, but for the summertime where we don't need a lot of insulation around that calf, it can work and has worked on many operations. As we look at some of the other classes of animals that might be on a bedded pack, such as our transition dairy cows, we typically keep them on some sort of bedded pack. If you can dry lot them during the summer, minimize the time they actually spend on the pack. That'll reduce the amount of straw that we need during the summer months. And even going into early winter, as long as we're not extremely cold and we do not need to protect the teats from frostbite, we can probably get by with fairly minimal straw as long as we can keep a dry, hard surface for those animals to lay on. It's important that if we do try to reduce the amount of straw that we use in these areas, that animals are still resting on a fairly dry base. Trying to stretch the straw as long as possible before we change it is also an option to reduce your bedding costs and bedding needs for the coming year. In some cases, newspaper has been used as a replacement for straw in bedding operations. I think this could be a possibility. However, keep in mind that the wind moves the shredded paper around very easily, so it makes for a much messier bedding and aesthetically may not be exactly what you want on your farm, but maybe a mixture of some shavings and straw as well as some paper would be an option for us to, again, extend those straw supplies that we do have. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairymen to really begin thinking hard about bedding decisions for the next year, making sure that they have ample supplies of straw available for both bedding and their feeding operations.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.